Welcome to the final reception, final sort of exhibit of the Catalyst 2020. What I liked about this project that it was very polyphonic. It had many voices, and we have many multiple modalities represented here, from curating, mapping, building, writing, etc. We don't have writing, but you have some writing on it. Building, virtualizing. We have the main modalities represented. In a way, we are sort of the little model of the school. And it was important for me to sort of demonstrate the idea that you can be polyphonic. You don't have to be taken by the single-mindedness of any one particular discourse. But in the meantime, you don't have to compromise the overall critical project or the overall brief. So that there's this tension. You have multiple voices, but in the meantime, they're different. There are different discourses here represented, but the project is the same, which for me is the idea of the architectural school. If it ever has an institutional critique, it operates like that. And the project title was The Architectures of Reassurance Between Emergency and Play. Again, very broadly defined. Whatever architecture does, it always reassures. That's the idea. It reassures us that everything is fine, civilization is ongoing, things are standing, right? It sort of closes the gap. In this regard, in today's society, we are situated in military, logistical, virtual, techno-digital kind of world. So every one of the modalities is speaking to that idea of control, space, governance, and design. You can find some common threads between them, but they're still quite different. The idea is today that each one of the section instructors will briefly speak for 5 minutes, and then the students will take the floor. They will speak for maybe 15 minutes. We'll go around, we'll start with mapping, we'll go to the building, we'll go to the virtualizing, the building, and then the curating, and then we'll again convene here and sort of discuss. At the meantime, our guest critics today are Boris from Wiseman, curator for, how do you call it, creative collaborators.
Boris.
Yeah, Boris, you all know Boris. If you don't, you should. And we have a representative from MIMSA, PhD student, Alia, yes. How could I forget your name? And of course us, the section instructors and guest critics. We're all sort of, we'll be jumping in with questions for other sections, right? That's the idea. But at the end, this should be like a gallery talk rather than like a final presentation. So I think we should start with the mapping section over here. I think Gabriel's not here, so you can introduce briefly what your section did and just briefly speak about your project. So I will invite everyone to this side of the courtyard.
So thank you everyone for coming. We are the mapping group. As Vahan mentioned, our professor was Gabriel
and Gurga Basic. Yeah.
And we sort of undertook a just like mapping exercise where we individually became both collectors, the analyzers, and the synthesizers of data.
Yeah, so we read about psychometric mapping and about how you navigate the city through experiences that you want to engage with. So we kind of came up with an itinerary of places that evoked some sort of emotion or some sort of like longing in where we wanted to go. And so you'll see those maps on the left side of the presentation, and on the right side is all of our paths kind of combined. And none of us had used ArcGIS, so we all got to open ArcGIS this week and kind of troubleshoot the process of bringing in paths and waypoints from our tracking devices, which is our phones. So it's kind of like a dialogue about how we use our phones and about who's watching and stuff like that. So you can read these how you like. It's very much up to interpretation and how you want to draw comparisons.
Great. And the project is in Minneapolis, it seems to be.
Yeah, so we all embarked on our own adventures on Tuesday.
Okay. And with Gurga, the idea was that he wanted you to take part in every step of the way as the maps are created, from collecting data, right, to synthesizing, to visual artifacts at the end, because most often we are inheriting the data, right? We're just left with interpreting it.
Yeah, usually architects just receive the data and then
Right.
interpret.
Do you have any questions for them briefly? Our critics, our guest instructors, guest critics?
You mentioned that this half is more affective in the sense that this is this is affective, so it's more driven by where you. So you mentioned that this is where you wanted to go, and then this is a more.
This is a collection of all of our paths.
Right, but you had, initially you had said that towards the left, there's some distinction between the map and the left and the right.
Yeah, these are the individual ones, and then these are all them compiled.
So please walk around, ask us any questions.
You were very concise. I gave you 15 minutes. You did it in 2 minutes.
I mean, what's the takeaway for those of you who were students in this section? What are your main takeaways to carry forward?
I think it was an interesting, we had a lot of conversations just as a group because we were kind of left to our own devices a little bit. So we had a lot of conversation about how much of this is planned and how much of this is like something that you discover as you walk, and we also had this conversation about whether or not Minneapolis is like walkable to do these things, because I could argue that like I wanted to go home or I wanted to experience something that wasn't within a walking distance just because Minneapolis is not set up that way. And Gurga kind of funnily, like in a funny way, he said like he had never met a student that had to drive to school. So like it hadn't even occurred to him that like this may not be conducive to Minneapolis in a lot of ways, and that a lot of these early studies are done in Paris. So it's a much different typology of the city. So I think it says a lot about the city.
Did you learn anything about yourselves while doing this? About the way you walk or don't walk or behave or don't behave?
I think that it's all really personal. I think we'd all have different answers, but for myself personally, I think I thought a lot about where, because I'm from Minneapolis, so it was like, how do I let go of like what is preconception, and do I need to let go of that, and kind of like what is calling to mind. So.
Well, it is a very interesting project because you are speaking about frictions of theory and practice of mapping. You're saying Gurga Basic came with the idea of doing the same thing that is done in Paris, in Minneapolis. Sort of very Midwestern, sort of very modern American city.
Yeah.
And then you all of a sudden discover the syntax of the city, the way it is articulated, the way it controls, etc. So this is very much related to the virtualizing section. This was, I didn't even plan it, so it's nice that you're speaking about this, the relationship between actual city data, the frictions that you encounter, and you map them. I suppose the points are your, where you stopped, these points that we see.
Yeah, so the points that you see are where we stopped, and the size of the points and the opacity of the points is determined by a few factors that we were observing when we were at our spots.
So you walked a lot, it seems. A lot
I mean,
of points.
collectively.
Yeah.
This is driving. Yeah, the bigger point is driving.
Oh, I see.
I didn't walk.
What happened here?
So that's like anywhere you see like a spiker or whatever on that path is kind of like the phone trying to find a signal.
Yeah.
So it's not actually a path, but I think it's part of the conversation.
Another glitch.
Yeah.
If you have more questions, you should ask. Otherwise, we can move to the next section. What do you think? Yeah.
So I would love to learn a little bit more about what actually is.
Okay, let's do this. Yeah.
Maybe artists.
No, we have time.
Yeah, where's Josh, Laura, Maddie, Magumo, Gabrielle, Terry, Julie, Mary?
All standing behind you, Gayla.
Yeah, come on out there. I mean, Ethan's doing a great job as your spokesperson, but it seems this is a team thing, right?
Could you guys explain some of your maps? Like some of them seem to be looking at that one has hats on it. This one has like visual data. What sort of things were you looking for on your individual journeys?
So on our maps, well, basically we all had the same kind of general criteria because we were all aiming to create a map that we could compile together as a group. But I think also what happened in the individual maps is on our ways on our paths, we found our own interests as well that weren't necessarily related to the criteria that we set. So I mean, some of the things we were looking at were like number of people at a waypoint, stress levels, which is it was all kind of just like how you felt. Some of them were like more numerical, obviously, like number of people, how many hats you see, but other things were just responding to like how you felt. Like, do you feel that this environment is loud or quiet? Which is kind of subjective. I mean, because for example, Gerga actually said he doesn't feel like he experienced any loudness in this city, but that's because he's from New York. And so what I think of as loud is might be different than what he thinks of as loud. But yeah, I mean, I think some of us in our own personal maps did diverge from like the attributes that we decided on. So like, for example, I was partially tracking like cracking ice on the sidewalk because in hindsight, I think I didn't fully understand what our goal was because kind of like Eden was saying, psychogeography is like where do you feel you are led in the city? And sort of there are these moments like, oh, I want to go grab some coffee and I'm going to stop here. But on my particular path, there were like lots of open, wide spaces. And so I just decided this is a moment where I'm going to mark a point. But it was kind of somehow also insignificant. But then I like looked back and really like I was just playing with like stomping on ice the whole time on my pathway. And so then I was like, okay, that was important to me. But then I also was compiling like some of the information that we tracked. Like I kind of thought like I took like a kind of a silly approach, like tracking how stress and hats, like hat sightings are related. Because Gerga also mentioned like, you know, as kind of like a scientist, you have to be careful of causation and what is it? Correlation, thank you. Whereas like as a designer, you can kind of take advantage of some of those things. Like if you're telling a story, as a scientist, it's kind of dangerous to go in that direction. But as like a designer, yeah.
So all of these were maps that you made after going on your adventure, using information that you collected.
Exactly.
And then you kind of applied your own subjective experience to the way that you portrayed it.
Yeah.
Whereas the right-hand side is a lot more just data points,
Yeah.
a little more scientific, you could say.
Yeah. I mean, some people chose to maybe just stick with the attributes, but then it's like about how you represent it. And, is north facing upward? Is land depicted as water? Like how can you play with different representation to kind of disorient the viewer in some way?
Did you ever think of superimposing the affective maps on each other? Because I see here you've done kind of, you know, more scientific mapping of your journey, but I wonder, you know, is there any correlation between the parts of the city that are bright and loud and where there's most ice crunch, you know? Like, I wonder if that's something that you did, because obviously you weren't all experiencing these factors individually. You chose to seek out a certain facet of your experience as you were walking around, but there were other, I mean, maybe you were paying attention to the ice cracks. Someone else was looking at sound and stress level. And I wonder if there are any connections to be made, truthful connections, not in the scientific sense of a correlation causation, but this is how I felt when I was here. This is how someone else felt when they were there. I'm just wondering if you tried that.
We didn't. Well, we did.
Oh, we did?
Yeah,
Oh,
we have
take away.
we have like I'm sorry the labels are separate from the actual what's going on, but these each represent two different factors kind of being compared to one another. I don't know if Maddie, you want to like call one out.
Okay.
And if I can remember which one.
Okay,
it is.
so the top middle one is actually our own separate pathways, but looking at how many people we saw at each waypoint. So it's kind of like giving you an idea of a pathway without the path. Let's see, the lower left one is temperature and duration of activity. Oh, I said left when I meant right, sorry. Yeah. Number of people was tracked in that very large one, the black one. Yeah. Yeah, it was just kind of like testing different ways of, but I think I see your point, like it wasn't like, I think we took some playful liberties here that like we weren't able to compile together or like didn't, I guess.
And I think unfortunately we came with these this morning. Like we brought them together this morning. So some of this comparison will be drawn during this event.
I wonder, I have a request. Can I ask people who create these maps just to spend 1 minute describing what is there and what is the attraction, like you did? Mm-hmm. Is it okay?
Yeah. Enrique?
Yeah. So my tracker actually turned off at some point, so I couldn't record the waypoints. So my
This is your
no, my tracker. This one over
this
here.
black one.
So because of the absence of waypoints, it became more about the path and how Gerg was very. He really wanted us to begin to abstract a lot of the what our findings were. So I turned it into like an object and then sort of blurred the line of where I was actually collecting the data, and then I split them up to these puzzle pieces that you actually had to flip, move around and rearrange, so that you can, instead of becoming a map being this thing that's very utilitarian, it became something that you had to solve in order to be utilized. So that's kind of where my map really came from.
Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about mine that I meant to not put the base map on it because I see the city as just a scale that is not in an actual scale. When I first started my path, it was like very windy, so the first thing I think is to go indoor. And then when I stay there for long enough, I want to go outdoor. So all these different boxes is like indoor and outdoor with the indication of where I tend to look at. It was inspired by the movie that we watched on Tuesday called Pursuit, that the scale and the duration and even like where things circulate is like very blurred. So I'm seeing the city as just a building that you go indoor and outdoor and see different things. So the red line is where you tend to look at. And after I finish this, I'm surprised that like sometimes in different spots, I'm actually looking at the same direction or like to the same focal point, but I didn't even realize it just because of the orientation and the environment that indicate. So the outdoor one, it looks like a building or it looks like a space, but what I'm trying to draw is the place that is walkable, and maybe if it's like the front door of the building, then I just trace that shape that I feel like is walkable area.
This is my map here, and specifically what I did is I went on a path and I sketched moments that made me like want to stop in these places. So that's what each sketch represents. And then coming back with the information that we collected, the size of the circle depicts, for example, the largest circle is like the stress I felt in that space, and I wanted to see if like what I remembered of that space. For example, like the highway and being like further out of my comfort zone of like in the city, not really knowing where I was. I think that's what led to my stress level being so high. Compared to, for example, here, I was inside a building, it was warm, and I felt more comfortable, so my stress level was much lower. And to pair with that, I did the noise level, which I kind of started seeing this like pairing that in the places I was stressed, there was more noise in those places. As well as I decided to look at, again, the lighting conditions of that space just to see what the information was telling me. I decided to eliminate the path because I didn't think the path was as important to tell my story, so I decided to get rid of the pathway itself, as well as I flipped the map, so this was actually the southern side compared to the north is on the bottom, just because I felt it was just taking me wherever I wanted to go on the path, so really I didn't have a specific direction I was going in.
And this one, who's the author?
Or the bottom.
Or the one on the right? Or yeah, on the bottom.
No, the bottom white one. Maybe she's not. I think she left. Okay.
It's fine. What about the one on the right?
So this was mine, and I was tracking my main path along here with all my waypoints without the base map to sort of obscure where I was in that way. And then I broke down my journey into 3 main experiences and collaged them based on some of the attributes we were tracking, the 15 different things at each point, but also just some of my personal experiences surrounding there. So here, a collage of travel and then being downtown, and then here resting and stopping along the river, but also like noticing that it was kind of this historically industrial place with all the mills and everything like that. And then on a secondary level, having these alternate connection points between all of my different waypoints and my point A to point B, just looking at alternate connections and ways to get around and travel the path that I took.
Thank you. Nice.
Alright, so being a very analytical person, my brain isn't quite meshed with how psychometric mapping is meant to guide you through a city. So I took a more clinical approach. Every 1/10 of a mile, I took a measurement of how many people there were. That was pretty much it. What was interesting to me was the seemingly kind of random number of people who were in different spaces, even over this, that I could see in 2 minutes, changes dramatically. Maybe this is 5 people and now it's 20. So maybe class that out. That's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you. And this colorful arts and crafts project. Oh, that one. Okay.
My path, I was walking on foot on campus, and I was trying to compare the noise level with the number of people, because going to a place where that's crowded doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be loud or distracting. So I did that manually on Photoshop, and for example, I found that in the library it's crowded, but the noise level is low. Whether in other outdoor spaces, it's the opposite. I did that in the morning, and then in the afternoon, when we explored more on ArcMap, I realized this can be done in this scientific way, where the radius can indicate the number of people, and we can control the colors to indicate the noise level, and it actually gives actual numbers, a table that we can use to track the quantitative quality to, which is a more scientific way than what I did, but it was nice to see how we can represent the same thing manually and then on ARC.
And mine is the last one.
Yeah.
I chose my waypoints based on when sounds kind of popped out of the general soundscape. And I thought of the path more as kind of a series of experiences and turns within spaces, as opposed to kind of an overhead view of the map. So I colored different kinds of spaces that I was feeling according to different colors, and then the width of those is kind of the size of, correlated to the size of the space that I was in at the time. And then when I turned, it goes off towards the direction of the turn. And then for each of my waypoints, when a sound came out, the sound seemed to be more related to a tactile feeling than something visual. So I created different kind of elements to touch to kind of bring to mind those sounds that popped out of the soundscape.
Huh. So you feel in color and then you hear in tactile?
I guess so.
Okay, pretty cool. Okay, should we move to the next section perhaps? Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
So here. Yes. Can you see us, Sam? Do you want to come closer? Perhaps you can come and stand here.
Okay. I think it's on the. I think we're really
Trying to bring the camera, so. Do you want? Yeah. Mike Christensen was the host faculty for the virtualizing section. He'll give a brief introduction, right? And then students perhaps could speak of what you did.
Sure.
Does it sound good? Okay.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'll do my best to speak for Alan Sag, who is unfortunately unable to be with us today. But we had a great time working with Alan, and grateful for his input. The way that we structured the work over the course of the week began with our group sitting down together and doing a couple of things. One was spending some time looking at Alan Sag's existing research at Harvard, and as well as his work through his studio in Vivia, and simply writing down a list of questions and beginning to collect images and sketches that could somehow begin to test questions that Alan was bringing to the table, testing those questions through what is for us a familiar environment, and that is Rapson Hall itself. So broadly speaking, Alan's questions, his interest has to do with intersections between virtual and physical environments and augmented reality. Responsive environments in particular are an interest of his. And so a lot of the things that the students began looking at had to do with, let's say, thinking about how stimuli or sensors within the environment could somehow pick up on forces or movements or changes in atmosphere that are in some way invisible to our normal vision, let's say, and then how we could in some way use those stimuli to drive response in an environment, whether that response was mechanically driven, electrically driven, but in response to, again, stimuli within the environment. We were also lucky to be joined by my colleague, Jala Khosravi. Jala, you can come forward. Yes. And Jala is heading up our effort here in the college to sort of reinvigorate, restart, give life to our virtual reality capabilities. And so with Jala's guidance and assistance, we were able to try out some of the new technologies, get some hands-on experience with the facilities that we're starting up here in the college under Jala's direction. And then we also were able to make some connections to not only product design, but also computer science through sort of the loose network of our Digital Design Center. Would you like to add to what I've said as an introduction?
The part of activity that we did during this week, we had a visit of an interactive immersive visualization lab in computer science. They had a variety of projects working with virtual reality, and I think the student could get a better insight of what we are how they can approach the interaction between physical and virtual environment and spaces.
I think one of the things that I was continually interested to see during the course of the week's work with the students was the sort of dual attention on what does technology make possible in terms of action, interaction, and so on. But then the implicit social and political dimension of the work, that it always carries with it some form of critique of existing ways of seeing or familiar ways of seeing. And so I put it to the students, in fact, at the beginning of the week, before we were even joined by our guest. And I suggested that if the week's work ends up with more questions than we started with, then it's probably a success. So if any of the students are willing to speak briefly about their work, I think that would be fantastic. Maybe we could hear a little bit about how the we end up with a lot more questions than we start with. So that's an introduction and an invitation, certainly, for everyone to step into we have a name for it, our hallway of virtualization and query the projects.
Where should we start, Mike? Do you have a?
I'm sorry?
Where should we start?
I think
just open.
Yeah, it's
whoever,
quite
whoever
open.
wants to
it's quite
speak
open
to
exploration.
Who's the author of this?
So this is
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, so what we began looking at in perhaps in courtyard is we were trying to figure a way, began looking at the daylighting and the harsh sunlight that happens, so it makes the space somewhat unusable when you're kind of working in a group or doing a review down here, as people who are familiar with the space know. So we wanted to have something be reactive to that, but also acoustics are also a bigger problem when you're up in the balcony and doing things like that. So we're finding a way to have it respond to both. And something that Alan said that stuck with us that we went forward with pretty heavily was he always tells the students with technology to do the most that you can with the least amount of technology. So we kept ours as a fairly simple mechanic. And then, so we were beginning kind of with these sun studies of just perhaps and seeing kind of how the light does move through the space, and we noticed that it always is this pretty harsh bar coming from the southern clear stories that then just slowly moves across the space. So just focusing on almost diffusing that space.
Yeah, so our next step was looking at precedent studies, which are translated then into our material explorations that we chose. So first we chose these wood panels, and we priced everything out and did weight approximations as well, since it is on a pulley system. Obviously, that's a big factor in this. So then we did the pro cons of each one as well. So we figured out that wood is probably a little too heavy at 120 pounds a panel. Probably not a lot of people can operate that. And with the wood slats, it's going to have weird shading in here, which is not really solving the issue that we wanted. And then we explored fabric, which is seen in the second precedent study, and then here as well. This was the second lightest material and the cheapest as well, but there was less control over this because we wanted it to be sheer enough that light could still come through, but then that didn't solve the acoustics problem that we were having. And then we finally settled on polycarbonate panels, which was the most expensive, but they are the lightest and the most, or the best at solving both the light diffusion and the acoustic problem as well.
The panel's kind of set up as each panel takes on like one day from what's going to become what's going to become with the balcony. And the key raise, the rope actually goes from through or past the second floor and the first floor because we didn't want to have just one area have control over like these. We didn't want the courtyard to be favorable or just the balcony to be favorable. So both sections can decide whether it goes up or down, which we thought was important to kind of share that responsibility. And later idea that Zala brought up was that maybe since, because before we had motors moving these on a sensor, but Alan talked about that idea of doing the least amount of technology, so having it more manual to accommodate different people's needs at a certain time versus just like a machine indiscriminately raising and lowering these. So what we talked about is being able, since they're pinned at the top, being able to lower them into the boat, so it almost puts them away. So it's almost like a rim around the base of the courtyard, these bigger plastic pins. So almost like putting them away in a sense. So you don't have to choose between one or the other. It can still be the existing one if need be.
I wonder if you consider the possibility of people disagreeing.
I'm sure there would be disagreements. I'm sure it's like, okay, we need shading for the courtyard, but hey, we need like a sound barrier like at the top. So having to work that out.
But it can be a possibility for social interaction.
Yeah, exactly. You like to be guys kind of this idea of like the review being covered, but there's almost like a peak in the facade of the balcony.
Interesting. Thank you. Very interesting project. Does anyone else want to speak about the other projects at the group? You have quite a diverse set of tests that you did. What is this one? Who's this one, for example? Nora. They're not here?
Oh, jumps back, right?
Briefly, sorry to put you on the spot.
So basically, we were doing the virtual reality. We were kind of introduce the sunlight. It's kind of the disadvantage of virtual reality. So we kind of thought of the shading of the sun, but without breaking the appearance of the exterior. We were thinking about like using the shading inside of the building and create another layer of the program above the head. So there's like an open space. And also a solution of the acoustics inside of the courtyard. So we created this kind of the playful portable platforms that people can interact with, and eventually they can become a shading if we place them all the way through to the end. And that kind of be one of the solution for the sunlight, like the extra exposure. And we looked for some precedent studies, especially for the acoustics. So there are the one done by Kendall Kuma. There's especially this one, the hanging buffers, that could be one of the solutions that for the acoustics makes the acoustics in the courtyard a little bit better. And here's the explode axon that kind of show you different layers of the platform, and they have the capabilities of holding people on there to be playful and almost like a term of architectural folly that people can interact with it. And also for the circulation, we kind of used the space that right there's a door that people actually can get into the third floor space, and people can get access to all the platforms of it. So
the uncanny curve. I'm reading the titles; they're fascinating. The uncanny curve, whatever. Perhaps in shading, strategy, playful platforms.
I'm curious about that one.
Yeah, that's the crazy title. Who is the author of this?
I don't know if my other group members.
I'm sorry.
It's all you, buddy.
Yes, representative of the uncanny curve.
So that is a play on the condition called the uncanny. What is it?
Uncanny valley.
Uncanny valley. I was going to say.
Right.
The uncanny valley, where basically when digital reality becomes too close to our reality, you kind of get disoriented, or like you get a little lost and you feel sick at sometimes. I think it was originally coined with regards to robots. When robots start looking too human-like, it's like it almost like disorients you, it makes you feel uncomfortable. So we were thinking that we could kind of recreate that condition within Rhapsody through this curve of TV screens, these like curved TV screens that line the inside and the outside of this device. And as you go further in, it kind of disorients your reality by changing like what you're viewing from Rhapsody inside these TV screens. And so the further in you go, the more it looks like a 3D model, kind of like a rendered view. So when you come out, it transitions back into the reality. And then what people would see on the exterior of the device would be kind of like a silhouette that gets more and more pixelated as the person walks through to the center and then exits. That's what this diagram is showing. And so in order to, I guess, capture that, or in order for this to work, you would have to essentially line the walls of the TV screens on the outside with cameras at eye level that kind of all face outward, or the vectors would be facing outward in relation to the curve. And then on the inside, we're thinking there's sensors or something to capture the person as they move through it to kind of project this silhouette on the exterior.
Pretty cool. Yeah, pretty cool.
Reality.
Yeah, reality.
What is that? What's this about?
Because it makes you question, like, we're becoming so, I don't know, the 3D world is becoming so realistic, it makes you question where, like, the digital self is placed within our current reality. Like, when digital merges with real life, VR.
Like, the detachment.
Yeah.
Yeah. You get that.
Which means home-like. So for something to be uncanny, it's something that is almost like home. It's like a room that you walk into and they move all the furniture over by 1 inch. It's all the same, but it's completely different.
Yeah.
And so I like that divide, because it can be something as simple as being inside that corridor and seeing what you would see accurately outside, but your depth perception is still off.
Right.
Yeah. The idea being that it's like home, but it's not.
Yeah, it's like
Somehow I imagine this being installed on the Washington Bridge as you cross the bridge.
Yeah.
Things becoming less real. Yes. Yeah.
How big are those TV screens?
Things become less real as you reach the humanities on the other side.
Are you finding yourself in the wrong bank for us?
I have a question for the group. What was your like big takeaway? Like, what did you learn?
Good question.
For the group, but Martin, not maybe not.
The group, or like our group in general, you mean like the whole
Yeah.
virtual lesson class? So this is an open question to everyone then.
Take it away, Martin.
I learned that, I guess, I don't know, technically speaking, that these things are possible, and after seeing what Alan has done with his projects, it kind of like opens up a new door to exploring crowd interaction. I know he's interested in crowd psychology and how people interact with smart materials and these like devices. So it kind of opened up, I don't know, a new way of exploring possibilities related to that.
I think what's interesting is that Alan's sort of approach is reflected here. He had one quick metaphor and then dense sort of sophisticated technical exploration of how it is done.
Yeah.
So there's no talk, just a metaphor, a title.
Yeah.
There's no performance of discourse, whatever. You start with the title and then you just go on and on and on, figuring out how should we build it. It's interesting that unwittingly everyone ended up reflecting that sort of modality in your work, which is quite different from what we did at the curating, etc. It's interesting to see the range, the uncanny curve, and that's it. That's the story. In a technical exploration. It's pretty cool.
I'm thinking less about the curve part of it, but more about the passage part of it. And passages that are so typical to this city, like skyways or tunnels, which are kind of the main criticism of that, which is justified of isolating whoever is inside from the outside, from the reality. That can be just incredible to investigate that.
I was going to ask if you'd considered sound, whether there's a different sound experience inside the tunnel as opposed to what you would hear. Because I'm seeing that there are acoustic issues in raps in the town.
Right, like a day ago we were deciding whether or not we should try to incorporate sound, and then we kind of just left it. It's like 4 days to do this. We're like, it's getting too hard to
Was it a conscious decision to disorient? Like based on Alan's work and the presentation that he gave, it was more of a reorientation of like one of his projects was about empathy and an architecture of empathy, and this one kind of subverts that a little bit and takes it to a place of disorientation. So I'm just curious as to like what.
I always had that in my mind, disorienting someone on purpose. I really wanted it to be more sinister and like that nightmare scene in there. But I don't think my teammates wanted to go that route. So I just decided with disorientation. That explains it.
Great. Mike, do you want to have any closing? Where's Mike? Oh, there's Mike. And do you want to add any closing sort of thoughts, or should we spend some time with this one too? Maybe
It's up to the students.
Yeah.
If you'd like to say something about the
I don't want to put students on the spot. Yeah, we have a few minutes here, but we can.
50 seconds.
50. How are you timing? I have 2 minutes on my.
They're being shy.
There's something about sound.
It is about sound, so yeah.
You'd like to speak?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, briefly.
So our initial idea is drawing some connection between reps and flow. And looking at the courtyard, we found this interesting verification. One of the wings, almost nobody goes in there, but it's a very interesting space. So we're thinking about somehow bring some aspect of that experience to the courtyard. So after once we realized that the acoustic was actually really interesting, it's a really private space, but when you're walking through, since the sound bounces around, you are really self-aware. So we wanted to bring that experience kind of to here. So we started with kind of a maze-looking path. We chose material based on kind of how it's very experimental, so based on how the sound bounce on the surfaces. And we did some research. We found this music museum where they have these string instruments they interact with. This kind of wall is like 2-layer. On the inside, it's kind of like wood panels. And we were thinking maybe adding that to a part of the experience. So overall, the entire experience, when you travel through this path, what we were thinking is your steps trigger this sensor where it plays the very echoing sound, steps, and then as you go into these little nooks, it becomes less digital. It's actually your own sound, your own sound dancing within the space. So that's.
Yeah, so we recorded some sounds back in the fire escape staircase as well as sounds in the courtyard as well. So with Alan, we kind of talked about how could we make this virtual as well, but because of the constraints of the virtual facilities over here, we were asked to make codes as well. So after a while, we might plug in the sounds to go with the mock code so we can get the experience. So what we again realized was some questions that we asked was how can you make the intangible tangible? So I think that was one question we kind of debated throughout the workshop.
So Alan was interested in something that is unseen, how do you make it visible? So we chose to work with sound, which is very prominent here in Rapson, especially during this week. So many sounds at one point, you don't really notice what's happening. Even the self is kind of withdrawn. But in the fire escape sectors, you're really aware of the self when you're moving around.
Right.
So kind of combining both together, how do we experience, isolating these experiences together is what we're looking at.
Great, thank you. All right, thank you, virtualizing group. I think we should move to the only object of the architectural exhibition we have, this oddly beautiful object here, and have the building group present us. Lida, do you want to... Where should we stand? Where do you want to stand?
Oh, it's just around.
Just around it. There's a camera, so come here. Yeah.
Where's my crew? I'll gather around. Oh no.
Yeah,
Here.
building group, please. Take the stage.
Okay, hi. So we're the building team, building and representation team, also. We have been working this week on essentially developing a kind of prototype for an assembly system, a temporary assembly system for a structure for the sake of a kind of temporary event, which is now this event. The project kind of engages ideas of cheapness, of assemblage that can be both assembled and disassembled. So it's concerned with deployability, its ability to kind of become a full environment made of numerous parts, but that can be also reduced to kind of a very simple amount of parts that almost seem like very, very few. So it goes from being able to be a full environment, but also kind of not be made of much. So we can see there's been a few video documentations in the last couple of days of this thing kind of going up in what will be an estimate in about like 15 minutes, if enough. And there's a kind of loop video that just kind of shows all of these little parts kind of becoming this big-ish thing in very little time. So it's concerned with that, with deployability, cheapness, but also disguising the cheapness through some kind of aesthetic techniques like painting and texturizing, some milling. Yeah, that's what we're doing. Then we kind of spent some time learning some representation and animation techniques, where the students essentially imagined their own version of the project. Like if they were to do this project, how would they do it? What materials would they choose? Which environment would they put it on? We made a series of animations of that, so you should find both kind of custom versions of some of the elements that the students made, as well as versions of the whole thing that they imagined through this video animations. The project also kind of engages the conversation of the ready-made and the custom. So it was essentially like it's made with like kind of off-the-shelf, a lot of off-the-shelf materials that then have been customized in one way or another, meeting existing objects kind of halfway, right? So just because we are dealing with deployability and assemblage, we don't just take those kind of aesthetics for granted. We still kind of impose our own authorship in some aspects of them, but always kind of safeguarding that the whole thing kind of can come down to just a simple, identifiable series of parts. So there's structure, there's joinery, there's a way to kind of land on the ground, there's tiled platforms, there are wedges to negotiate that groundscape, and there are panels that might mimic something like a prototype for a wall system, for example. Yeah, so it's a kind of proto-architecture, prototype for an architectural assemblage proposal. We like ask everyone to kind of go up to the ladder, just be careful. You can sort of view all the videos from the top. Hi. Maybe like run it on the spot. Maybe like if people have questions, you're also welcome to ask. But I know you have a lot to say. Let's put it that way. Do you want to say something? Or wait for a question?
I think I can jump in real quick.
Yeah.
A lot of the sizes that we use were pretty standardized in a way that you can use and reuse the materials that we used. So from 1 inch all the way to 4. And all the little connector pieces, we left them untouched in a way that you can also reuse them for future projects, or at the same time, return it.
Yeah, one thing that Will touched on was we were designing for returnability and kind of looking at the new kind of transaction system of renting. So like all the parts, I believe the plan is still to return as much of as much of the parts as we can. So all the joinery can be packed up and returned to the store, taking advantage of Menard's 90-day return policy. Some of the hardware can be returned. Within the piping system, originally the piping system was based off of a 10-foot by 10-foot piping system that we would be able to return. Unfortunately, we had to cut it, but in discussion with some of my peers, we really decided that there's potential for the PVC pipes beyond this use. A lot of construction, you need a 2-foot long piece of PVC piping, but you can only buy a 10-foot long piece. So there's an opportunity to reuse these in actual construction as well.
And the idea to make them modular or like similar, like the least amount of like same sizes, was to be able to make it more customizable for different uses.
I guess I can talk about kind of the material. So intentionally we dematerialize this PVC piping because one of the critiques that we have is like a lot of this plastic architecture, they all have this like, plastic finish to it. But how can we think about just by applying really simple surface that can like kind of add values to this material? So a lot of people don't really know that it's there, like PVC piping, but looking at what we have done with the set and the spray paint.
I mean, the project really, I think, brilliantly sort of explicates how an architectonic concept can be made out of the logistical, numerical, unitized situation that we find ourselves in. What do you think about the project conceptually as students? Have you thought of new architectonic for yourself, for your own future projects, perhaps? Looking at Lida's project, Lida's work, how they sort of take unitized economy, logistical economy, and make an argument about sustainability, make an argument about architectonics and building in general. Have you thought about your own future architectonics or any concepts? I mean, your animations perhaps reflect the object itself, but if you were to build something completely different, given the same set of constraints, what would that be?
I think from my own point of view, I could see myself, utilizing this sort of a technique to develop something like maybe even, furniture. Or we talked about, developing a system of platforms to support different things, plants or whatever. Also, I think another element of it that appeals to me, in my own way of looking at things, is sort of like the intentional misuse of everyday objects that you can get at any hardware store.
Also, the idea that she was talking about is that you can ship it somewhere, in and out, and then build it with certain rules or your own rules, but it's more of send it anywhere. It's the ability to build fast and take it out, reship it to other places of need.
Yes, I'm curious about if the idea is it's a disassemblable, redeploy somewhere else, or I can disassemble it and the pieces become available to someone else. To what extent were you guys having conversations around like, how would that happen? I mean, were you beginning to speculate? Can you talk about that?
Well, we discussed the system as maybe kind of similar to the way IKEA has their flat pack, system where everything fits in a very flat box that, maybe even the panels could be part of the packaging, or it could be held together by straps. The straps could be incorporated into the support structure, that sort of idea. Yes, for
Yeah, I guess.
deployment.
Thanks, John. I guess I'm also curious though, like what would be the social system? What's the economic system? What's the sort of others that this as an architecture can do that's more broadly changes the way that we're in community together.
I think all this. Sorry. Well, no, I think one thing we talked about is this is a proto architecture. It's kind of material agnostic right now, depending on structural needs. PVC piping can replace with steel piping. One of our precedents was one of Lida's projects where she took this scaffolding system used by, I believe, UPS. That this company's only purchaser is UPS, and they designed the scaffolding system that controls their conveyor belts. And through looking at that system, using the same kit of parts, I was able to design things like a home gym using the same parts. We talked about like concert architecture and stuff like that, and then how changing the skin on things and looking at kind of IKEA's idea where it's like a fiberboard covered in a veneer, and when the veneer is ruined, you throw away the whole thing. But what instead, if you just replace the veneer with a new veneer, you've got a new piece of architecture. So it's more looking at building this kit of parts that can constantly be changed and evolved to create different things, as opposed to having custom things for every single purpose, different things. That kind of makes sense.
Well, I mean, so it sounds like there's an entrepreneurial spirit that it might be that it begins its own company, and it's a company starts contracting with other things, which is different than like a co-op or a sharing that happens, it's a shed next to Seward Co-op in the neighborhood, and people, there's a reuse, or it's things brought in and out of wraps. And I was just curious what kind of discussion.
No, but I think it's a critical question. Like in some way, I think what you're asking is who does it?
Yeah.
Who assembles it? Yeah. And like, who does it raise questions about how it is assembled, or does it need auxiliary things like instructions or tools or access to resources to put it together? So, things like that. Just I think in some way the interesting thing about comparing it to the IKEA model, IKEA, the sort of trades of flat packs, things, and gives you this kind of flyer instructions. In doing just those two things, essentially offsets the labor of assembling something onto you, gaining that margin, right? Like they no longer need to do the assembly. You do that in some way, in a minimal way, and you become part of that supply chain. And at some point, you're like, we're working for IKEA for about 3 hours on a Sunday, probably with your roommates.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, the other related question then to the supply chain part of it is how does it stay out of the waste stream? So, so we have all this PVC pipe now. How does that stay alive and continue to contribute in some way and not just become part of the waste stream? You don't have to answer that. They're interesting questions.
Yeah. It's a real question with this piece in this building too.
It sure is.
Did you do anything with the interior? Like there's a screen in there now, and it seems like it's an outward facing thing. I really want the screen to be not about employment. I was wondering if you did any work in the screen, what that would be. Especially if you're thinking about this being an open source structure that can be anywhere, and what it's better to have in that sense. And you talked about it being modular. Are there screens or exteriors? Are there other things that you thought about that did make it to this version that are a different iteration of this version?
I guess I can talk about the process in general. Like the original design on day one is very different than that. But through kind of testing with the material and kind of the structural, we kind of arrived at this, which is for us structurally stable for the event of today. So in a way, we're not really thinking so much about the program. That is one thing that we're trying to stay away from. But let the structure itself dictate what it wants to be. So even the panels and everything, they are just a prototype to see what the structure can be, and then how could we use that to create something.
At one time, we were talking about it in the context of like it could be a garden shed, or some sort of like a little green dome or something, but not necessarily like a
But what dictates the structure itself? What dictates the structure itself? What were the choices like when you decided that it's this particular shape, this particular material?
Well, in the process of constructing, starting with basic blocks, in the process of starting in 10-foot sections, you can see you end up with like sag and like instability. So mainly our focus was to cut down on instability. That was the primary physical driver. But, as far as like programmatic or where the panels might be,
turn it on its own?
Sight lines, visual pass-throughs, or like a physical way you can go through it maybe was to be occupied, but that wasn't necessarily the goal.
You could use the mic because it's starting to get noisy.
Yeah, the project, like, it really resisted sort of beginning, starting from program, in some way attempting to make itself kind of like applicable to any programmatic, any event, right? So if it's an undefined event, how does something kind of become applicable to multiple of those events, that specified. So in some way it becomes hyper self-referential, where the structure itself is defined, as he was explaining, by its own needs. Like, as some vertical elements, some horizontal elements that can span in a way that they don't give. And then from that, the next cut is defined, and the next cut is defined. And a lot of the rule sets were also about this kind of standard sizings. We're only going to do cuts that are 1, 2 feet, and 4 feet in order to remain useful sizes, like for its own futurity, right? As opposed to 1 foot, 18th of an inch, which are hyper custom cuts, which make things kind of less, more finicky in terms of like future usability. Yeah, so in some way it very much resisted the programming, and we had some, like even near uncomfortable conversations about like why it makes us so uncomfortable to like not declare program initially. So in some way, when like at some point it was a potential garden shed, at other points it was a DJ booth for a single DJ, so.
And a diving.
Yeah.
What I wonder is if not declaring a program, I'm not sure if it's a question of access, I'm kind of shaping exactly what it's going on. But not declaring a program actually hides the program. You do make decisions, and these decisions are conditioned by something. They are conditioned by certain cultural reading, by certain architecture, by certain whatever that can be. And what I wonder if when you say that we reject the program, what you actually do is not be critical of whatever conditions you make decisions. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, decisions, yeah. Like gray has been decided. Gray is a decision. Like everything is a decision. Right.
Right in the middle. So it's kind of like it's threshold. Right? It's like extending the threshold of the TV by. So on higher scale, it goes deeper and deeper to the superficial or to the disguised.
The discussion that's happening in art, this is where I'm coming from architecture, discussion there is artistic. What does it really mean to say artistic? And often it means that what brings us to do certain art between decisions and construction to justify that itself.
I think it very critically actually stands for itself. Like it stands for itself, and it's critical in doing so. I think one of the biggest things in architecture is to resist that you're designing for a particular program. It's incredibly difficult for us to do. So I think what this proposes, that kind of hyper self-referentiality, where it's like it's only going to become 2 feet when it needs to become 2 feet. The plates only became a part, and therefore the kind of middle unoccupiable, based on the fact that the outer perimeter of the materials chosen came down to an 8 foot by 8 foot, therefore making the structure slightly bigger than the platforms, and saying, well, it needs to sort of expand out. So it made the middle kind of ungracefully occupiable for a human person for the sake of the negotiating the measurements produced by the thing itself. So like producing its own geometry kind of constantly. Had we started with the program, how we started with the sort of occupancy of the middle area, that problem might have manifested, that solution to that problem might have manifested in a different way, perhaps a middle board and then some outer pieces. So I think in some way, not in that, I think it engages that problem by resisting it, like starting there in a way. Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, sorry. Do you want to go on and then I'll go on? Yes, please.
Just saying about generally how we,
Yeah.
just generally this conversation is very interesting because the way we design buildings is often like negotiating programs many times, but when you think about a program as a constantly changing thing, it's not something that is suitable for a certain moment, certain time, and that's why like the idea of thinking about space rather than program and provide a generic space based on other assumptions might be this trait that is really there.
I think there's an interesting, the program is us, the program is the exhibition itself, and the problem is how do you display architecture in architecture? That's a permanent question for architectural exhibitions. But many critical architecture starts with the program. All I teach is critical interrogation of the program, and I address the same sets of issues. So there's maybe a conscious choice that no program, meaning the program is us here, the review, this is the program. I wonder if it was a conscious critique or a choice. The thing is almost like performance frozen, and you have that which is grounding the object, decorative. The foundation of the building is hidden. That which reassures is always hidden. It's the least decorative part of the object standing. In your case, is there like a commentary? Is there like, why is it the most decorative part of the object? Or
the foundation, meaning the sort of the foundational wedges?
Everything on which this thing lands on, right? This, yeah. It's quite decorative, right? Like, is there a critique there that you wanted to perform through this decision?
So the wedges and the bases were identified as like places where you can have, where students could have like authorship that were also kind of limited in scope in some way. That's like it's not taking over like the whole panel, so therefore like a 4x4 3/4 inch sort of like piece of material, but it can be like concentrated moments of design that still kind of function within a hypermodular system. So each one of these can be like, it's like one of the students, two of these are each one of the students, one of the panels, each one of the students. So it like meets the project halfway between the hyper generic and like and customized. So it's like it's also not saying that because you're designing a modular system that is generic and can be for any event, it has to be undesigned or it has to be like unauthored in some way. But then it tries to exert that authorship in ways that make sense to a kind of system of resource shortages or like resource awareness in that way. So instead of the whole panel, instead of the sort of bigger panels, it's the smaller pieces.
Yeah. I mean, it's
It's repeated smaller
right.
pieces.
What's fascinating is that that's the ornament. Ornament is usually not the foundation. This is quite interesting, quite radical, I think. And I think the little letter next to the object is just brilliant. It just makes it all seem like a part of the same story.
Fire escape.
Yeah. Should we move to the last one, I think, and then we'll convene here and discuss the overall exhibition. And this group, yes, absolutely. Sophia Deutinger was a guest faculty for this group, for the curating, and I was the host faculty. Someone told that the camera is creepy, and that's the point, because ports of entry subject you to a regime of surveillance and control, and is always creepy, the way you have to take off your shoes, etc., etc. So, but go on. And the title of the exhibition is "Enter Here." Would you like to briefly speak, and then we'll have students? Yeah. Without mic?
I don't know. It sounds so.
Big.
Yeah, I think do you understand me without mic? I think it's better without mic. If you don't have the mic, you hear that it's right. Yeah. So yes, this is the curating group. Vahan and me were kind of, I would say, in charge somehow. I'm not a curator, so you're also not a curator, probably.
Yeah, partly. We're both partly curators, partly architects.
Yes.
Right?
So,
Semi.
For the day.
This is general, also in general.
So the process was like that. I believe, at least from my experience from curating, it's good to have a certain amount. And the biggest, the nicest is when you have 100% of it. And so we tried to collect this 100%. The theme was entry to enter the United States. And largely we said there are three ways how to enter legally in the United States. It's by land, by water, and by air. So we tried to get all entry points by land, water, and air, and to curate these entry points. So here you see an overview of this map. The green ones are the land entry points, the blue are water entry points, and the red ones are air entry points. Air entry points are specifically interesting because you land in the middle of the United States, and you will see inside. You see here on the table in the middle, there are islands of internationality, or when you land on an airport, you are, as long not in the United States, still you show your passport and you kind of are behind customs, then you are legally in the United States. But before you are in this weird no man's land. Yes, so after we collected all, let's say, entry points, you see there are Excel sheets where the entry points are shown. So photographic evidence was collected, and also data evidence like the amount of entrances per year and so, or entries per year. And this evidence was reassembled in different ways. Like here, in terms of land, you see all land entry points between US and Mexico, but stitched together. So all the, let's say, desert or land between the two shades was erased, so that you have a continuous line of doors. Same was done with the ports. The airports also kind of in the middle, stable for airports, was scaled up so that these red dots appear as large islands between the United States. Yeah, the students then can say more in detail about the concept of of the whole studio and of the exhibition space is that the United States are like a room. And when you enter the United States, you go through a door. So we have here made a room with 4 doors, which we potentially could close now. We thought about, let's say, opening the exhibition like the performance. Open. So we potentially could close off the exhibition. Yeah.
Should we go in and hear from the students?
Yes.
Should we go in?
Yes.
That sounds good. That's perfect. Yeah. Which group should we start with?
We start with land, huh?
Yeah.
Start with land.
With the land group.
The land group.
So whoever doesn't fit in, you can see us from outside. The land group are the south and north.
The exhibition is set up. Here's Canada, here's Mexico, there's Japan, and there's Europe.
Do you want to take it away?
So the land group, as Aaron starts to explain, the collective information on every single port of entry on the Canadian border and the Mexican border, and those are displayed in the sections. So all the generic information, which is very hard to understand or read. And we're encouraged to collect visual data, so that's where we've got all of the aerial views. They're all arranged in order and labeled for these 2 rows here. Mexico all fit in one strip, and Canada there's a so many break into 2 strips. And then below are pedestrian level views from the street of each of these border crossings. So it gives you kind of like the experiential view of crossing the border, more distilled aerial view of what the border looks like in these different places. And then there's some data distilled down from this chart right here of the different categories. So are people crossing on foot, are they crossing on a personal vehicle, are they crossing on a bus? Are they a driver of a truck transporting goods? And that's all captured in that chart there. On the Mexican side, there's a few details here, select points. Also look at some of the typologies once you cross the border over a river bridge or at an international airport that actually spans or at a large, actually the largest hours and hours with big lines to different states. Look through this and all that. So the sections then up above are kind of conceptual through process.
Note that I like all the data.
When you use the mic,
it takes very long the process of curating. How do you have to?
Yeah, we're trying to turn it on. So people from outside the United States can sort of see us and hear us. You know, we're within the US, and then they're go on. Yeah, they're outside, but they have to see us.
Yeah, I was just going to say the process of curating from kind of a global spectrum and you have all the resources available to look at, and then you when you have that data and that visually, you have the ability to sort of that you want, and you begin to take a decision. I'm not sure that we were completely able to begin taking a decision because of the sheer amount of data we have, but it does sort of begin to show itself as you
Did you guys speak about the position you took of having a solid red line next to your side?
Yeah, I guess that obviously the evident by the level of security at the Mexico border versus the Canada border. You can see some of the Canadian border crossings are just like one building, one lane road, and it's very, very short on the Mexico border. And that was all kind of speaking to the actual vertical wall that is being built between this border and then the very
Do we have the water next? Yes, please.
Yeah, so for water, similarly, we looked at the different ports of entry. What was hard about water is finding where people actually come into the U.S. Ferry traffic wasn't all that apparent, and especially when doing our initial research, we found thousands and thousands of seaports that only took in cargo and not necessarily the actual people, not necessarily being doors to people, but being more of these spots that they drop off items and goods. So eventually we switched over to more cruise ships and sort of identifying 40 ports that took cruise ships with the top being the images of the ports, then pulling it down, extracting what these buildings actually look like and sort of the sizes of ships that they can handle, and then sort of a comparison in the size of the ships, how the cruise ships actually come in. When they cross international waters, the sensor goes off, and then they actually have to contact these harbors and get help from a harbor pilot to take them into the actual port. And then going into more of the passport and credential side of it. And then we started to question the nature of the water border, sort of pulling it out and abstracting it. Whereas the land has more of this divide with a line of actual borders. The sea is sort of not necessarily random, but it's more fluid and more based on the geography of it, so questioning the nature of that. Which I'll see you're nodding to more.
I think you covered it in a couple of questions.
About water.
Did you find any significant difference between the specific class?
The East Coast is quite obviously much lower. It's lower image in terms of number of ports. And so being referred to these images is basically an abstracted version of all of the ports lined up similarly to how the land group did, but aligning all of just the ports. And so what would the land mass be if it's just made up our ports and comparing that?
The East Coast, just in general, the East Coast seems to be taking a lot more people, and it also seems to have a diverse, more things we didn't get to, but early, especially of course, amount of areas that you can go to traveling from the East Coast versus the West Coast, taking in smaller amounts of people and having a limited range of only going to pretty much Alaska and sort of Canada from Portland and sort of California and other places like that.
So I was here. So basically, what we looked at on the center display all the international ports in the country. So kind of as an initial start, we compiled all the information of so we were able to find some individuals that are able to enter the country. So We have not only the amounts of international airports, which is just about 110, but then also annually we look at about it's like 19 million people, so it's not as large of amounts of people that are actually entering the U.S. Internationally through airports. We're seeing kind of large amounts, especially in the land. But what we are really interested in is not only the amount of people that were coming into these airports, but then also we started to look at some of the imagery, the satellite imagery of each of these airports. So as you can kind of see along the border on these three sides, we took those 110 airports and then traced out what we consider to be landside, airside. So what I'm saying that landside is meaning more of the airport terminal. And then the airside is actually the property of the airport, so like landing strips, takeoff. And then pertaining to that, as you are entering the country, as you can kind of see, we also have a section of that portion. So that is just illustrating the process of actually technically legally landing into the United States. So you're not legally in the United States until you pass customs. So what we wanted to show were all these different pockets and overlays of the actual footprints, which is what you see here, scale equally to one another, in the country that are considerably not part of the U.S., right, as far as legally when you're coming into the States. And then as well, overlay the occupancy as well. So each acre is about 30,000 people. So it really kind of starts to depict, so a lot of our locations actually didn't have very these over 30,000, but the main ones like JFK, MIA, and Dallas, those are the kind of the three main ports into the country. Which one of the interesting things that we found, we were actually able to look at the incoming countries into these locations. There's actually a fair amount of people that come into those ports that are from Central and South America.
What is the scale shift of the land territory in red?
So that is just proportionate to each other. There's not, the only deliberate actual comparison of the scale is just in the actual size of the airport as a comparison to the amount of people that are actually landing. So there's not like a deliberate, like this is 10,000 times larger than the actual airport for the scale. It's just more of a comparison based on location and size.
What is the scale of the
No, that's the each 8 inch is 30,000. And then big thing from that's wide, like that. Or can I say that? Yeah. Boy.
This might not be something that you consciously addressed this curation, but it seems to me that the legibility or the form of each of these exhibits does correlate in a sense to how long it takes to get to the U.S. and how quickly the U.S. is legible in those different. Sorry, I'm quiet. I mean, as I walk around, it takes far longer to process the information in the maps for land and sea than it does for air. Because you immediately kind of have a set in the United States. So, you know, these, even if you have the photos of the pedestrian crossings, that's not legible to the United States. So, it seemed that even as I was consuming your putting together your data, that there is a technical element here, but you know, it takes longer to kind of unpack what arriving CS, you know, maritime might be as compared to this thing. All right, I'm going to get from some country or something, well, not but from a place to another, it's like, oh yeah, I'm here. And how the United States becomes legible as a state and these different kind of modes of travel is really maybe something that I thought was if you did it.
I'm not sure how to consider it, but if you fly through the road, experientially, your entry to United States is the moment of boarding, because they can deny you boarding.
And I, for example, take it into account when I have connections, and I'm trying to have my connections outside of the US. Because if I have a connection outside of the US, I need to go to cross-border control, which makes my connection fly. And that kind of connected with this project with the very first piece that I'm discussing, the psychometric mapping. And I wonder if this kind of investigation can connect to experiential mapping of actual active entry through some, looking at all some of these points, and how these two data sets
I mean, do you think the experience can be made into a data? That's not the question. Do you need to make experience entirely legible? They have procedural maps, but it's a great question for the students too. What's your position on it? If you convert the entire experience, broadly defined, into a data.
Defining legibility of experience is a altogether different question.
Right.
Well, I mean, like this process is a virtual right.
Right.
So I land and I get to customs, and well, then at first I see a TSA officer, and he asks my name, and then I do the visa thing, and he's like, "Why are you here?" I'm in school, and then if something's off, and someone else comes by, and you go somewhere else, and so there's a lot of nothing everything's fine. Although I'll keep saying it. But I mean, there's a lot that this process leads. I mean, there's lots of little branches that go off depending on who you are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in that sense, I mean, even if we're not unable to talk about qualitative what it's like, I mean, you could take everything on this wall down and just do a, sorry, I'm guessing the way. You could do a whole, like a flow chart, but way, way more crazy about that. More possible permutations and how this could go wrong, and then how you might end up in the United States. But then there's like all these other tree maps of how you did this last year. We don't know.
It is a great comment. Because the starting point was that actually to produce something like that, tree metaphor even was used. But the intent here was to avoid the idea of exhibition viewer as an experiential subject that comes in and sort of can soak in the information. It was more to put you outside of the ports of entry, so you're totally aware of the entire theatrics. It's a completely different relationship rather than you being in the center of it all and experiencing. Otherwise, we could have had people asking you to take off your shoes, shouting at you, or whatever, having you undergo the experience. There's a completely different starting point in which we maximize the distance, right? It's satellite imagery, it is data, it's like complete distance between you and the ports of entry. In the meantime, we are in the little area that is the United States. And then there's a camera looking at us. There's some little bits of experiential elements.
Now talking about the curator, about it as a curator, right? This can actually be a very interesting tension to explore this tension between having a gut view from above and having actually going through the process and experiencing the process. So you're right that it's a very different points, but they both valid and both very absolutely explore.
Different reasons.
How you combine them in the framework of the same exhibition is a very interesting question to dig into.
Having both sort of Brechtian theater and art-Artian theater experience at the same time. Crazy. Blaine, you wanted to say something, I think. I heard. Yes.
Thank you. I was listening to a great word. I'm just curious with the students, I presume they understand something differently about just having experienced this week. Just curious how this workshop has changed your guys' towards the built environment and how we consider territories and things. That's great.
I'm bringing it to you, Java.
Speak to the mic.
And then we started to think of something it's sort of a process of breaking on syllabus and
I'm just struck particularly by the curating concepts that Theo talked about gathering and analyzing the data. That as architects, we do ourselves a disservice by not having the live data to support the reasons of our opinions, particularly when we're working with the public and working with vulnerable clients who already have safe trust towards the system. You know, it behooves us to do our research and know what we're talking about in order to reassure them, right? That we are
should we reconvene in the center and talk as
Yeah. Let's go around and. Brutal timing, maybe. 2 minutes. Oh yeah.
I'm on time.
Yes. Yeah. Is everyone? Should we? Yeah, it's a good idea. I just get. Should all the faculty and the critics gather around here? I suppose this is a good spot. Or we're around. We will be at the sort of center stage, and just briefly address the entire exhibition as an idea, or the work as a producing an exhibition during the week, having 4 different modalities, 4 different discourses, and then having the same set of critical attitudes, perhaps. I would just say one thing, that most of the groups had no idea where they're going to end up at the end. They had a hunch. They had a starting point, a well-defined starting point. And I think that's a recipe for original work. If you're very certain where you're going, it's just mediocre work is produced. And I think that was intentional on my part, and our part as critics in general, to not be absolutely certain what we're doing and not be certain about the goals, but have a hunch, have a hypothesis that's defined, have a starting point, and then what you see as a result. I just want to give opportunity to you, to critics, to guest faculty, host faculty to speak, or any other faculties here, to the entire exhibition. You were what?
I want to support
Yeah.
I'm trying to propose it. So I really value the emergence of the process that you didn't have in where it goes. And emergence is a very important structural kind of concept that we work a lot now with respect to software processes. Processes emerge, very complex processes, very rarely are planned and executed. If this is how you do it, most of end up with something you won't end up with. So having emergence as a principle to curate an exhibition, I think, is a very interesting and valuable goal. What I would ask, and I wonder if anyone would have an opinion about that, is exhibition necessarily does it have to be the end goal? So if we end up from a point of complete openness, that we don't know where we're going, we really need to define exhibition as a goal. Or maybe that should be also open, and that what kind of shape or form we can take in the end of such a long program.
I would agree in the statement that I don't think the end product is necessarily the goal of this. I think Catalyst really asks questions, and it leads to even more questions. Like, I don't think any of these projects are necessarily done. I think they still have generated many questions between us and the faculty, and I think we still have a lot of work to do and still a lot of questions that have been left unanswered. I think that's the goal of Catalyst, for me at least.
Other reactions?
thinking about the exhibition and how each of the 4 experiences were different, I think that's something really valuable to have in Grapset because we're so used to the homicides and an X, stand up in your spiel, and then receive criticism mostly in one way. And so I think the immersiveness and also the different strategies that we use is something that I hope we all carry forward in this building.
If I understand correctly, we're thinking about reassurance, right? Architecture of reassurance. And as we went through these different modalities, what became clear to me is that the notion of architecture being able to reassure is throwing into relief that I don't know that it does. As we went to the group, we saw there are maps that have this sense that there's a lot of noise and there are people that you're disturbed in some sense. Or you're thinking of, resolving an acoustic or visual conflict in perhaps a common core, or, that there's a necessity for a structure like this, or that, this is all, everything about order crossing is unsettled today. And so I think really when we think about, and this is kind of at the crux of most of the humanities, but it's like, are we really, everyone knows, like, are we humanists? Do we really think about ourselves? Because I feel like reassurance is ultimately an incredibly narcissistic concept. We're all bad narcissists. We're all thinking about ourselves. How do I feel more grounded in my environment in a particular situation? And that's at least that's one of the many issues that my discipline deals with. But it seems to be across discipline that, how do we find ways to exist comfortably, generatively, productively, in solidarity with each other in environments that we actually have produced for ourselves? A lot of the reasons why we feel the need to reassure ourselves is because we've produced these situations that are so inherently discordant or unsettled. And this exhibition is so rich in, I think, addressing some of those questions, or at least approaching new questions, the idea that there's an openness at the end of this. And that's kind of been on my mind. So if anyone has any reflections on this question of reassurance in architecture, whether or not it really does that, you've all been having these conversations over the weekend. Are you convinced by the idea that architecture reassures us or can reassure us?
I'd like to hear Marta or Theo speak on that question.
Very, very didactic, but yes, that's a good idea.
I'll get to it in a second.
It is a great observation. That's again the point. Architecture does not. Architecture, classically speaking, the conventional normal architecture does not, and there's nothing normal about reassurance today. It is quite weird, and there's many frictions, and there's hence the title. Architecture's a plural. There are many different kinds, being the logistical enterprise, being the surveillance enterprise, being the legibility mapping, right, or the virtual reality, or there could be any number of others. These just happen to be the most used modalities in architectural schools. In the architectural school, thinking about architecture was the intent of the catalyst to catalyze, right? Everyone's, I think it was a great reading, so thank you for noticing that. And yeah, any one of our guest faculty wants to speak about the notion of reassurance.
I only have to think about crash tests. So,
crash tests.
Yeah.
Right.
The nice thing is about reassurance, anyway, with architecture elements, like concrete and so on, you always test it till it fails, till it crashes.
Right.
And reassurance is only possible if you know when the point of breaking
occurs. Right.
It's our whole construction, every construction element is tested to this point. And that's somehow beautiful. We figure out when does it crash, when does it fail.
Right.
And from this point, we draw the line to the reassurance. I don't know if it says about that.
Yeah. It is even your project is very much taking that very normative, conventional architectural language and then doing something absolutely conceptual with it and critical. Although you say that the conceptual is never the goal, maybe, but it is to be boring and conventional and just do boring architectural drawings. But in the meantime, that observation itself is again conceptual. You just made an observation, a very banal thing that we do as architects, reassure that the material stands, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I believe in this. Like now, what we need to collect is all this big data. I don't want to, but collect is 100%.
Yeah.
While anyway, we always have to question if it's 100%, but we try to achieve 100%. We end up with maybe 99 as well. But this is very boring, and you not ignore this boringness, not too fast jump for the excitement. So this labor, it has a beauty in itself, and also Excel sheets have their own beauty, and that's why I'm so putting the
emphasis.
Bigger emphasis on the boringness,
right?
Because it leads to beauty, or needing.
As a way into.
Right. And also gives us time to dive into the subject. You need a day or two to get into the thinking of borders. This meditation, time of meditation, and boringness, I think very or with light, it's probably cutting relevant.
The labor is.
As an act, it's very, I don't know.
I don't meditate.
You don't meditate?
No, and I don't feel assured by by much. Maybe I think that's why I find what you're saying kind of provocative. That we have, there is. I don't think there is reassurance. I think we are actually in a peak moment of unassurance. We're not reassured by anything. We've created a bunch of systems. We're in a hot mess, and we can't look at any of them for the things that will make us feel okay with them themselves. Your example of we've created passports, and now we hold ourselves accountable to everything that means. That has created an enormous amount, and continues to create an enormous amount of stability. And we can't look at passports for reassurance about passports, right? So it's just the very systems that we produced are not the very systems that provide the relief from those systems themselves. And ultimately, it's not to sound negative. I find this incredibly a moment of necessary dynamic engagement, but that is the moment. It's we're all kind of floating in the air about this topic. So maybe I see these things as much more evidences of discomforts than reassurance is the re part is not there yet. At some point. Or the assurance part, it's not back to being reassuring. We're just kind of in a moment of need to question quite I don't know. That's
It is the truth though. They are declared as to be reassuring. That's the project of surveillance, of logistics, right? That's the declared goal. We're going to read it for you if your anxiety. You're more comfortable with us staying at home, ordering with Amazon. Yet, quite the opposite.
And I've heard this example a few times, but 2 days ago, the New York Times covered the pandemic by showing a person with a mask holding an Amazon box, saying, "What if Amazon couldn't fulfill your orders?"
Right.
So no mention of what if there's a demise of civilization? What if but what if Amazon came to a halt? Right? Reframing. Yeah, that is the difference, right? Somehow the pandemic is reframed through the fail of the efficiency of the logistical system that is supposed to kind of give us an ease, it's supposed to be frictionless, right? It's called frictionless.
I suppose,
Material exchange, and if that doesn't happen, that equals pandemic. If Amazon
it's a crazy sort of moment of truth.
We're well beyond.
Maybe this is a little sentimental, but I'm something that Vahan in studio talks about a lot is the sort of the agency of architecture, and then something that the architecture lobby talks about is the role of architecture. And I think that I'm reassured by the work today that isn't necessarily a building. I think that the breadth of creativity and showing that architect people, as students like me, can think in these more abstract and conceptual ways. I'm heartened by that. I don't want to see any more exploded axons of building. I want to see people thinking in creative ways.
Can I double down? I think on maybe because in some ways creativity translates. We have some narrow definitions for it, and what I see here today is a lot of engaging with systems and quantities, and I've talked about this for days now, the multiplier.
Yeah.
Right. That it's not so much a single exploded axon, it's a system of 1 times 1,000 million equals architecture, or it's planetary scale, or whatever it is. I see in every map that I look at, and it's a little more hidden in the work, but I can talk about it. I won't elaborate, but I can talk about it in terms of that. But creativity as engaging that multiplier, that as opposed to a single act or a single object or a single thing, which is what exploded axon points to.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think to also go back to Theo's point, we don't have to do away with the building and the conventional discursive knowledge and history of architecture. That even that is, it can be situated in such a way that is still made relevant and speaks to the larger societal, socio-spatial situations in which we find ourselves. So conceptual architecture, that's a good point that Theo brought up, is not necessarily architecture that does away with conventions. We're a very normative and boring discipline in that regard. But in the meantime, we come with tradition, history of being boring and being normal, because maybe that's what people want. That's a very reassuring character, a role of a boring person that does its job.
Yeah, and I unsettled our interdisciplinary guess.
But the question is really not what is the role of the architect or architecture, but where is the architecture happening? And architecture of emergency, architecture of play, where architecture happens on many levels. Design thinking happens on many levels. And the brief is shared tacitly across modalities from business enterprise to data set designs. Our task here today is to make the brief legible, that is shared across modalities. The brief is somewhat of the more you know, the better you design, perhaps. So it's a surveillance paradigm. There are many paradigmatic sort of moments shared across modalities. And I would say design thinking happens on the level of government, planning, business, technology, etc., and so on and so forth. So the question is really, where is the architecture? And hence, if we identify that, we are able to situate ourselves, given our history, our obsession with buildings, towards that environment, right?
Linking it back to emergence and systems. Emergence actually is a system.
It's a process, right?
In theory.
Yeah.
And the more independent different parts of the system are, the more connected they are, the more is a chance for unexpected emergence to happen, and the richer that emergence is.
Mm-hmm.
And then in this whole discussion of architecture, what is the connectiveness of architecture outwards to everything that happens outside, to the entire system?
Mm-hmm.
What is the responsibility of architects as being part of that system? So the discussion of role of architecture, kind of what is the boundary where it becomes counterproductive by isolating architecture from this, all of these interconnected parts.
Yes.
And kind of drawing the boundary instead of looking at interconnectedness of that.
Yeah.
There is a lot of, if I kind of, when I'm looking at what happened here today, I can totally imagine it being part of an art exhibition in a museum. Art is becoming kind of this extremely expansive field that can include pretty much anything.
Right.
And I can also imagine things that happen in civil engineering going into the art museum to play a role there.
Yeah.
And many other faculties here, medicine, et cetera, et cetera. So that interconnectedness, I think, is something very important to think in the context of system thinking and in the context of how we make things emerge. And also another note on the exhibition.
Yeah.
Kind of, it's always a struggle, again, coming as a advocate of emergent systems, but then I work at a museum and I need to produce a product that goes public, that makes things public. So there is always this struggle between working in an emergent way and being open to evolution and being this interdependent beast, and at the same time producing something that you finally can put as a product on display. And that will make my process, or everybody else's process who's involved, available to other people to digest, to learn from, etc. And this is exactly what's happening here. So there is not necessarily a contradiction between having a product, exhibition product, and emergent product. But exhibition is not the only way by which we can make things public.
Yeah, that's a great point. In a way, it is a public.
There can be other ways, and there are
Right.
some elements here which are performative. There are some elements here which are maybe textual, etc., etc., etc. So again, going back to kind of where we begin with, when you have this week open, how? What kind of, and how do you define what happens in the end without thinking about it?
Yeah, we had thought of this. I mean, at the beginning, my beginning introduction of this was storytelling and architecture being a public discursive act of sorts. And it is a very public event. We had lecture series, a lot of things that are not reflected. So exhibition is one of the moments of conclusion, perhaps, or of new starts. In a way, we all engaged in different forms of storytelling, but we at the end believe that we are producing knowledge that's valid for architectural discourse. So it is still speaking to the history and tradition. Art has more liberty, I suppose, to be, and knowledge production is not necessarily the constraint, and the notion of project is not the constraint. A lot of it has to do with the artist's personality and stuff, right? So architects are, in a way, interestingly positioned to be speaking about the project rather than themselves a lot, and speaking about the knowledge, both to the public, for the public's sake, but also for the discourse of architecture itself. So I wonder if, like, students have anything to tell us about the modality of architectural storytelling that you engaged in. Any sort of final takeaways from curating, from building, from... As a storyteller, have you learned some other ways of telling stories and being an architect at the same time? It's a rather simple concept. You should be able to improvise on.
Maybe can we ask them if they do understand it as storytelling?
Oh, it's an interesting one. Absolutely, that's a good. It's a better. They do understand it as such.
Yeah. What I was also thinking, and this is like maybe back in this question, is, I mean, are those necessarily separate things? You're all in your first and second years of architecture school.
Right.
I mean, part of why architecture is so powerful is because you have skills. I mean, not to say that I don't have skills, but I'm in a department that talks about a lot of concepts, and we write and we read and we do these things. But I mean, you have a sense of what goes into making an actual building or a structure, and you're often charged with the boring task of coming up with a building that's utilitarian but also beautiful. And so to think of, you know, the disciplinarity of architecture is constantly that, you know, you're all people with your like little grid line things. And this is just a stereotype, you know, everyone's drawing out, measuring out the angles, things like that. But you really get to decide whether or not architecture, the word architecture involves storytelling, to the point that you don't have to say, do you see yourself as a storyteller, but you just decide, part of my architectural practice includes taking into consideration an environmental concern or a social concern. And so...
Well, yeah, it unwittingly involves maybe not storytelling, but communication.
Yeah.
We don't build, as architects, you know, construction people, labor people build. We communicate ways of building, for example, right? We always are engaged in speaking. It cannot be, it can be just a simple act of communication, or it can be more thought through, like a storytelling. But it's like both Lida's question, your question is important here. Did you see yourself as operating in the mode of communicating, a storytelling, or in general, what do you have to say about the entire catalyst?
I mean, we were definitely instructed
to do story.
To tell a story,
right?
In a way that I don't think the other sections were as strongly as curating was. and the word hierarchy was discussed. The idea that, you know, if your information is not clearly digestible, is it worth anything, in a way, you know? And architectural drawings, construction drawings, have hierarchy built in them too. And that's a form of visual and textual communication to the builder. But then to your point about storytelling, the client doesn't need plans. The client doesn't understand details. So you need to be able to tell them a story about the process that you're doing and what the goal is and how we're going to take them on this journey and how they're going to get to this building that is in their mind's eye or your mind's eye, and why that matters. And if you can't tell a compelling story, you'll get fired, or the project won't happen, or, you know, there's all these possibilities. Why hierarchy and storytelling matter to a building actually getting built.
Do you make distinction between story making and storytelling? That's another interesting story.
Okay.
So I work in the first museum building by Frank Gehry, and obviously that comes with a lot of legends. So and one of these legends is that when Frank Gehry came to do the presentation, like, well, there's a board and there's a long table, and architect stands kind of in the end and does the presentation, right? Frank Gehry came and sat in the middle of the table. Yeah, and he just sat like among the committee, among the board, and that set the tone for the entire thing. So even the model, that very cranky model that he put on the table, was almost kind of secondary to that act of, hey, I'm just one of you. That was act of story making as much as storytelling. And that gets back to the kind of performance of what we do here, performance of how we do, why we stand like here.
Right.
Why do we stand? Like, why don't we sit? Et cetera, et cetera.
I'm finding it a bit confusing out of us that we are all of a sudden in the, 15 minutes ago we were talking some systems.
Yeah.
Like multipliers, trying to like think through what like other architectural manifestations might be.
Right.
We kind of ended up in the like biographical and like, architecture equals building. I'm surprised by that jump in this conversation.
I think the conversation is still ongoing because the system tells stories about reassurance. The idea was to simplify the notion of discursive engagement or knowledge production for students. Storytelling seems rather a simple concept and not too intimidating to engage them. But the conversation is still the same, I would say now. It's about the systems telling story to us, reassuring or communicating. Maybe storytelling is not the...
Maybe, I mean, I think the notion of how systems translate onto an audience is everywhere.
Yeah.
I think that I like described it that way. That maybe equaling storytelling.
Absolutely, yeah.
Story making. I would maybe resist that.
Right.
Sort of like in terms of like, I think maybe like I wonder if I think for maybe some of the groups like storytelling or like story making might have been like more about part of the group, but I think maybe for other ones like manifesting sort of different tactics, like methodologies, coming back to the word like tactic, like it might be a time when like architecture finds like a third definition. It's not narrative. It's not. It's not boring. Kind of like
tactical
pragmatisms, but it might be tactics. So like there's a lot of creativity in what kind of tactics we deploy or how we define what we do through a series of tactics or methods. So I don't know.
Well, in that case,
I wonder if my students like relate to some of the stuff that I'm saying.
Before that, if you mind, do you find then your project, is it a project then, or rather a practice, if you don't have an overarching meta-narrative to deploy, or without that, is there a sense of project, or is it just a practice of sorts? Do you have a project then? With tactics. Given in general, in general, if you engage into tactics as the ambition horizon, you say no, it's not. I don't have any sort of meta.
It's not a building, but it's a project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a project through
it's a series of tactics.
which all speak to each other, I suppose, in a certain way.
Yeah, with an intent.
Right.
Yeah.
But not necessarily story.
That's fair. Yeah. I just wanted to like untangle that a little bit for them in some way.
Yeah,
to kind of
absolutely.
two options.
Yes.
And I thought we were like in a
No.
very rich zone within the systems.
Yes.
Maybe I might be confused between this back and forth a little bit, but are you saying that, you know, this isn't a building, but you said there wasn't necessarily a story, or maybe I misheard. Do you not think that there was a story in how this came together, or like the story being made?
There's a story in everything,
Yeah.
right? Like there's a story in everything, certainly. But I think like if we kind of continue to foreground that there's that architecture either like pursues a narrative, and with all of the things that might imply. I guess I would just like resist the word like story,
Right.
storytelling. You can have a project, you can have an intention, you can have an aim, you can have a goal, you can have a series of biases along the way. All of those are well and good, and they're real and up for being discussed. I just don't resist the idea of calling it storytelling, because it goes back to some of the kind of like ways in which architecture has been reduced to maps, right? Like kind of like phenomenology, the story based, and the practical, that's like the real estate algorithm makes buildings and what to do with it, right? Like, so I think in some way, like we were in this kind of middle ground of like systemic thinking that might imply some stories, might imply some narratives, might imply some biases, right? Data is biased. Data is storytelling, like storytelling can be reduced to data. So I don't know.
It's a productive complication of the term.
Yeah,
because a story
that's it,
has like a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you're speaking of tactics, which like is an ongoing. It's a process, and like tactics are a way of making it do.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily have to stop. So I think that's.
And it's things that I think like they can take away. Like they can take away like that, like the mapping project or the curatorial project, if interpreted as a tactic, like it's yours to have.
Mm-hmm.
You do the tactic and you do it like how you would do it. As opposed to storytelling, which has a little bit of like closure, a seal on it, that's like it maybe belongs to somebody, so you can't enter it.
No, what I think is really interesting and exciting about that is because I think one of the first times in my education is that it isn't about building, or it isn't about the end product, it's about making a tactic, and it's about sort of the takeaways rather than this building that we're plopping onto the site. That's
right, like your portfolio piece.
But I want to emphasize that there's an incredible thoughtfulness and sort of premeditation that happens before the discursive performance, even your lecture. So at the end, it is a tactic, yet you're telling, I want to resist the term too. I just find it very simple for students to understand. I would rather use the discursive performance.
The students can hold the nuance though. I think that's well demonstrated here.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I totally love this dichotomy because it maps onto my experience of after kind of trying to work in a particular way that resists the structure, resists the goal, resists the project. Kind of, I'm exactly the opposite of what you said. Like I resist all that and I have a story. But what I do find that there are very strong personal tendencies to accept one and resist the other on a very deep visceral emotional mode, where I just I literally cannot do projects. I feel bad. I think I will go depressed. I will quit. So, and then there are people who are exactly the other way around. And so there is that too. There is always the personal perspective, and personal perspective. It includes the culture where you grew up, but it also includes these things that I don't know what they're based on, but they drive you to work in a certain way, not in the other.
We can possibly argue that it is impossible to have a project without a story, without a discursive participation. So you can have a practice. So
And the world music.
So you might have a project at the end of the day. If a curator was curating your curation, they might end up telling a story. Yeah.
I think the main concern is whether you can hold all of those multiplicities and still produce something that's precise and intentional and deliberate. And I think that would look different for everyone. Clearly, it looks different for everyone. So, regardless of the terms that we use, but I think navigating complexity and simplicity is maybe the most
that's a better way. Interesting.
Is part of this.
Yeah. At the end, discussion, as Leida pointed, is more compelling on the level of the systems that we produce, the architectures, and the way they speak to our status today as a human, or to our status as a society, and so on and so forth. And the ways in which architecture can be a way into that system, just produce an interface threshold or a moment of consideration, rather than just be absolutely boring and normal and just move away. So, two different starting points. An architect that stops, creates something that's uncomfortable, this is quite uncomfortable, but it is very thought-provoking, right? Otherwise, you can just go and be in the business of making everything comfortable and comfortably sort of locking people out or comfortably locking animals away, etc., and so on and so forth, and then just be driven by this notion of reassuring, end up producing an enormous amount of violence onto the planet and onto other humans and so on and so forth, right? Yeah, the discussion can keep going. I feel like students don't want to jump in, so we should perhaps stop the formal process here, right? And convene at the reception area, perhaps? Is it so?
Yes, it's time for the reception. It's just over there.
It's over there.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you all.